Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Our top story today, the extent of homelessness in England has been described as a national crisis by a committee of MPs. A report by the All-Party Public Accounts Committee says the government's attitude to tackling it is unacceptably complacent. The government says it's investing more than £1 billion to help make more affordable housing available. Andy Moore reports.
This report says the problem of homelessness has been growing for years, with the number of people in short-term accommodation up by 60% since 2010. The MPs say there's an unacceptable shortage of realistic housing options. There are estimated to be 9,000 people sleeping rough on the streets every night. That's more than double the number in 2011. There are a further 78,000 families living in temporary accommodation, often of a poor standard, and that includes 120,000 children. The committee has described the situation as shameful. It's called on the government to focus on the supply and affordability of decent housing.
You need to stop being complacent about this. It is not enough also to just throw money at it. It needs to be money that is fixing the core root of the problem, that looks at why people are homeless in the first place. Critically, you need to be building more houses, yes, but they need to be truly affordable houses.
The committee now wants the government to come up with a strategy for tackling the issue by the middle of next year. Labour said this report showed that the Conservatives had caused the crisis of rapidly rising homelessness but had no plans to fix it. The government said homelessness was a complex problem and it was providing over £1 billion in the next few years to help deal with the issue. Andy Moore, BBC News.
Our correspondent Dan Johnson is here. What stands out from this report, then?
Well, I think the figures and the fact that this problem has grown consistently over the last few years. 9,000 people at least sleeping rough, but then another 78,000 households that are part of this hidden homeless problem, living somewhere but not having their own home. And that includes 120,000 children. That's quite a staggering figure. But also the language in here about the government's response, that does stand out. The fact that the department dealing with this, apparently the committee says its approach has been unacceptably complacent, that the limited action it has taken has lacked the urgency that is badly needed, that this light touch approach by government, the committee says, has clearly failed. Now, the government says it is putting money into this problem, £1 billion over the next 3 years. The government says its Homelessness Reduction Act and its Rough Sleeping Task Force will tackle this problem, but clearly a huge issue, talked about a lot at this time of year, something that's difficult to get right.
And we are going to talk about children who are homeless later on in the programme. Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you. Homelessness in England is a national crisis, and the government's efforts to tackling it are unacceptably complacent and an abject failure, according to a group of MPs. There are more than 9,000 people sleeping rough, while 78,000 families live in temporary accommodation. The government said it was providing more than £1 billion over the next couple of years to reduce homelessness. Now, the definition of homelessness under law includes rough sleepers, single people in hostels and people living in temporary accommodation. Since 2011, the number of people sleeping on the streets has increased by 134%, according to this report out today. Earlier this year, our reporter Leslie Ashmore spent time on the streets of Chatham in Kent, where the deaths of 2 homeless men prompted calls for more to be done to help rough sleepers in the winter.
The high street was mobbed. It was Christmas Eve, people doing their shopping. It was about 11:30 in the morning when someone realised it had actually passed away. You look at all these flowers that have been left over the last week, pictures, people have left all this stuff. This was where Michael stayed.
Michael McCluskey was in his 40s, a father and grandfather. A run of bad luck left him on the streets.
Michael was a lovely guy, always in top spirits. He was a great guy, West Ham supporter, I'm a West Ham supporter, so we always talked a lot about football. He was a real nice guy. You can see from the amount of flowers that people left and reading some of them cards.
And then, just a few days later, a few streets away, another person
Sadly,
died.
Greg passed as well. It's too many. The council, there needs to be something done. Why are these guys left out here? Why are we not looking after these guys? That's too many, and there's still, as you can see, there's still people on the street now.
No.
when the council can say this is enough.
It's problem. It's very problem.
It's not known how either man died, but their friends think the weather could have been to blame.
What side again?
I think it was the cold. Yeah, definitely the cold. It's got to be the cold, because he's found up there with no blankets on and all that, so it's definitely the cold.
How did you survive?
Struggle. Yeah, we use like popping McDonald's now and again. We've got a place up the road, caring hands. Just try and find anything warm in shops, walk through the Pentagon.
I've got like
during the
3-4
day.
coats on, 3 pairs of trousers, 3 pairs of socks, 2 sleep bags, and I'm still freezing during the morning.
What do you think should be done? What should the government do?
The government, they should come down and they should actually see the actual homeless people who are out actually homeless and like give them a place to stay. Do you know what I mean? Because like we're all suffering. Do you know what I mean? We're not all bad people.
Leslie talking to Barry and others in Kent earlier this year. Now, around 120,000 children are among those living without permanent housing. A separate report, exclusively seen by this programme, shows the huge impact that can have on children still going to school, with them falling behind academically, falling asleep in class and sometimes becoming socially isolated, anxious and withdrawn. The research by the homeless charity Shelter not only looks at the effects on pupils and their teachers, like health, hygiene and achievement, but also explores which parts of the country have the highest rates of homeless children per schools. Luton tops the table with 32 homeless children per school, London second with 28 and Brighton third highest with 22. Let's talk now to Shandor Nikitish, who had to live in an emergency homeless shelter with his 8-year-old son, Billy. Also with us, Kelly McKinnon, who is a school family liaison officer who offers practical and emotional support for homeless families, and Polly Neat, who is chief executive of Shelter. Welcome, all of you. Let me start with Shandor, if I may. You became homeless. There was a sequence of events. You had an accident at work, which meant you couldn't work, therefore you couldn't pay the rent. So you began to stay with a friend. Sadly, they passed away at the beginning of this year. So you literally had nowhere for you and your boy to go to, did you?
Well, that's right. Sadly, after his death, I approached the council and, you know, I had a problem. After a very turbulent time, I ended up in a homeless shelter, and I was there for a considerably long time.
Can you tell our audience what a homeless shelter is like to live in, particularly when your 8-year-old is living with you from Fridays to Mondays?
Well, the shelter I was in was very bleak. There was no atmosphere. It was grubby. You go into any council premises, there's inspirational posters, there's you know, slogans, plants, whatever. There was nothing. It was like almost being in prison, for want of a better word. Yeah, it was terrible.
And how was it for your little boy?
He just found it very difficult to deal with because there was strangers there. He had to lock the doors. He had to worry about, you know, where he's going, where was I, who was coming down the corridor. He had to worry about all things like that.
How long did it take for the council to officially acknowledge that you were homeless?
It took a couple of days short of 7 months.
Why?
That was just to acknowledge that, yes, I was homeless.
Why did it take so long?
I don't know. But I was asked regular questions like, can they contact my landlord? Well, sadly, no, he was dead. Did they contact the estate? No, they hadn't. I don't know what went wrong. I really don't.
And then one day you were contacted by a housing association and moved into a property. What did that feel like?
Oh, that was just... Even though the place needed paint and everything, the relief I felt was something incredible, and the happiness of my son was he couldn't wait to move in. He couldn't wait to explore the place. He couldn't wait to be a boy again.
Wow, you have brilliantly articulated the highs and lows of you and your son's life over the last year. Let me bring in Polly Neat from Shelter. You know, the government says tackling homelessness is complex. There's no single solution, but we're determined to help the most vulnerable in society. That's why we're providing over £1 billion up to 2020 to reduce all forms of homelessness. We're bringing in the Homelessness Reduction Act. In addition, we've established a rough sleeping and homelessness reduction task force across government with support from experts so we can respond as effectively as possible.
Well, it's not fair to say the government are doing nothing, but what they're doing simply isn't enough. So, number one, there just are not enough homes. And number two, people can't afford the homes that there are because housing benefits have been frozen. Unless the government is seriously going to tackle those two things, which are going to cost money, then, you know, as a society, we have to be prepared to accept the impact of homelessness on many of our fellow citizens, including children. And, you know, if your childhood is blighted by something like homelessness, you know, as a parent, it's really shocking, because if you lose your childhood in that way, you never get it back. You only have one childhood.
One thing that always comes up when we talk about homelessness, people sometimes say, some people say, look, they're not really homeless. They have a roof over their head. OK, it may be an emergency hostel. It may be temporary B&B. It's not as though they're sleeping on the streets.
Well, that's true to an extent, but actually if you've got a whole family living in one room, if you have to, particularly with children, if you have to share bathroom, toilet, kitchen facilities with other families, if you have that insecurity of continually moving and never having anywhere to call home, if you have the stigma that families feel, and particularly children at school, about their situation, then, you know, they are legally homeless. They're also emotionally homeless. And, you know, this is a huge crisis. It has to stop. We can't be putting up with this any longer.
Kelly, you offer practical and emotional support for children.
I do.
In the role of a family liaison practitioner. Tell us about the impact on children at school when they are homeless.
I often feel that the children get lost when we talk about homelessness, and it has a huge impact on their school and education. You know, from living in an environment like your speaker was saying, where there's noises, they're witnessing frightening things, it's hugely disturbing. And the transition that they have to make from one hostel to another hostel, not being in the same place, has a huge emotional effect on them, and also their physical well-being. They often arrive at school late and they're tired, they can't focus on their learning, so it has a really negative impact on them.
And that impacts the rest of their life chances, doesn't it?
Of course, it definitely does, and this is our future generation, and we talk about mental well-being all the time, and I think it's not going to be till later or further down the line that we're going to witness first-hand the impact it's having on these children.
Shandor, I wonder if a final thought, do you still see the impact on Billy now of that period of time when he was staying with you in the emergency hostel?
Yes, he is a lot more thoughtful and a lot more emotive to not only my thoughts and feelings, but other people as well. Yes, it has had an impact on him, but hopefully it's made him a better person. Okay. That's what I'd like to hope.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Shandor. Really appreciate your time. Happy Christmas. Thank you. Shandor Nikitish and Kelly McKinnon, School Family Liaison Officer, and Polly Neat from Shelter, the homeless charity. Thank you very much. Thank you.
MPs have branded homelessness a national crisis, condemning the government for its unacceptably complacent response. A damning report by the Cross-Party Public Accounts Committee says tonight that the number of people sleeping rough has soared 134% since 2011, describing the government's efforts to eliminate rough sleeping as the tip of the iceberg. Ministers insist they're providing more than £1 billion to reduce all forms of homelessness by 2020. In the latest in our week-long series on the issue, Paul McNamara has been talking to homeless people in Liverpool and Manchester to see what support is being offered to people with nowhere else to go. He joins us now. Paul.
Yes, good evening, John, from Manchester city centre. A city centre where you really don't have to walk too far to be confronted by the realities of homelessness. But as that report you've just mentioned highlights today, this isn't an issue isolated to Manchester. This is a national problem. We started the day in Liverpool, where the mayor there told us his biggest fear is that yet another homeless person will die on his streets this winter. It's the week before Christmas, in one of the nation's biggest cities, and this, a place for people who have nothing and nowhere else to go. But according to a report released today, the numbers in need of shelter like this are growing. The Public Accounts Committee findings revealed in England today there are 9,000 people sleeping rough, tens of thousands more in temporary accommodation, and a government failing them.
How long have you been here for?
21 years.
Have you been working here for 21 years?
Yeah.
Have you seen the numbers of people come through your door increase over the last couple of years?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Despite what a lot of people seem to believe, that most of them aren't in receipt of benefits, and it's very difficult then for us to be able to get them into hostels, which are all funded through housing benefit. So they're in effect trapped on the street.
Today's report is damning. It lays out England's problems with homelessness in stark terms, calling it a national crisis, saying the government's approach has been an abject failure. It says the Department for Communities and Local Government's attitude has been unacceptably complacent, with limited action that has lacked urgency.
We're seeing a massive increase, probably 400% or 500% in the number of people on the streets in Liverpool.
The Mayor of Liverpool says there is a lack of joined-up thinking between national policy and how that's actually implemented on the ground. It's a problem, he says, that's getting worse.
What is a real concern for me is, for instance, the likes of the welfare cuts and the sanctions and universal credit is forcing more people on the streets. And then, of course...
Are you seeing that? Is there a direct correlation?
Absolutely, we're seeing it.
The report says that all measures of homelessness have increased in the last 7 years. The number of people sleeping on the streets up by 134%. The number living in temporary accommodation has risen by about 2/3 since 2010, now around 78,000 families in England. And shockingly, some 120,000 children are without a permanent home.
Prime Minister!
In Parliament today, Theresa May defended the government's track record.
Families with children who are accepted as homeless will be provided with accommodation. And I would also point out to honourable members opposite that statutory homelessness is lower now than it was for most of the period of the last Labour government.
The report also identifies a vast and growing group of homeless that are simply falling through the cracks of government records. The hidden homeless, those who live in hostels or sofa surf at the homes of friends and family. The report says the government doesn't seem to understand the problem or even measure it. An investigation by the charity Just Life found there are 51,000 hidden homeless living in bed and breakfast. This man is one of them. For fear of his landlord, we're protecting his identity.
It's despicable, really. It's old Victorian.
Why? What is it about it that is so bad?
You could smell the musk, like the faeces smell like dirty drains, and you think.
The government say they are determined to help the most vulnerable in society and are providing over £1 billion up to 2020 to reduce all forms of homelessness. For those facing winter on the street, 2020 is a long time away.
Paul McNamara reporting. Well, now we asked for an interview with the Communities Secretary, Sajid Javid, and also Marcus Jones, the Minister responsible for homelessness. Both were unavailable. From the House of Commons is Conservative MP Gillian Keegan, a member of the Public Accounts Committee. And here with me in the studio is Brownie Albury, a spoken word artist and homeless support worker. Gillian Keegan, a very strong report that your committee has issued. But the government, of course, replies by saying, look, we're going to spend £1 billion by 2020. Isn't that enough?
Well, I think, first of all, you've got to look at what the report says in its entirety. So I think it's important to separate rough sleeping from also the temporary homeless situation, because they both have, whilst they both need homes for an answer, there are also more complex issues sometimes related to rough sleeping. So the 1.1 billion is what they're spending today on kind of, you know, temporary measures, but I think really the investment that's going to be made, that needs to be made, is investment in lots more housing, and in particular social housing, because a lot of this problem has come in areas where there's very, very high rental costs, and people who are on lower incomes obviously are going to struggle to meet those rental costs.
I mean, it has to be said that the government's not terribly keen to talk about this. I mean, we have tried really genuinely for nearly a week to try and get somebody from the government to spell out exactly what they are doing. What do you want them to do in practical terms immediately?
I think immediately what we need to do is have much more coordination between local councils, DCLG, DWP, and to have a clear plan for how we're going to target getting more of the right kind of housing, and in particular, as I say, that's social housing. So far it's been quite light touch. That's been kind of one of the criticisms in the report. You know, the responsibilities and obligations are there within the council. There's been some funding, there's been different pots of funding moving around, but ultimately you need to have a real focus on, first of all, helping rough sleepers with shelters, at least for winter, but also you know, to help rough sleepers on a pathway into a home. But those in temporary accommodation, they effectively have been evicted in many cases, or they've been given notice to leave because they can't afford the rents. And what you've ended up with is the government or the local councils are actually spending more on temporary accommodation than they would if they'd have prevented that person becoming homeless in the first place. So we need to have a more joined up strategy, I think, to much more focus on preventing people becoming homeless, as opposed to picking up what are greater costs when somebody's in that situation.
Doesn't the government need to go back to first principles? After all, in the end, after the Second World War, which is the last great housing crisis, it was local authorities in the end who understood each local need and built council houses and the rest to provide for the emergency that flowed from the war. Isn't it now down to local councils to be refunded and able to do the same?
Well, they have indicated in the budget that some local councils, you know, they will remove that restriction, so they could do that. Or it could be local councils working in conjunction with a local housing association. In my own constituency in Chichester, we spent last Friday actually with the CEO of the council, the head of housing, and the biggest housing association in the area, going around all the council housing, looking for opportunities where we can develop more council housing, and very good quality council housing, because also the building standards of council housing has moved on a lot. So if you look at some of the newer properties, they are really fantastic. So we just need to get a lot more of those built.
Could you just wait with us for a moment while I go local and talk now to Brownie Albury, because you're working essentially in High Wycombe, which is not a place one would think had many particular large numbers of homeless, but you say there are a fair number of homeless. What are you experiencing at the sharp end?
So we're seeing a lot of people that are rough sleeping. I'm afraid I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but
nobody does.
For instance, we run a winter night shelter from January through to the end of March, and we will be full. That's 12 bed spaces, and we'll have a waiting list for most of that time. And that's people who are just trying to get into the hostel spaces that are available, or desperately trying to pull together a rent in advance to make that first step into the private rented sector, which is sort of providing a lot of that low-quality accommodation that you mentioned for quite a high rate. So it's a lot of money for our guys to get together when they actually don't have a bed of their own.
But then when you're working with, let's say, the dozen that are in there tonight, if you were to distill the problems between them, there would be mental health, inevitably.
There would, yeah.
There would be people probably who have either had some rental crisis or a landlord who simply kicked them out in order to try and get somebody to pay more, or whatever it is. I mean, what are you finding is the dominant feature amongst the people you see?
I think there's a lot of benefit issues, for example, delays in housing benefit being processed, or universal credit as people move on to that, as that's coming in. That's a huge one that I'm seeing. I do a lot of eviction prevention work, helping people access, avoid eviction. And a lot of those issues are simply because benefits are not being processed quick enough or effectively or correctly. So there's a lot of work to be done helping people represent themselves in court or access the legal aid system. So I completely agree prevention is essential, but without a strong benefit system that responds to people's needs as they change, as mental health issues crop up or physical health issues or bereavement, you know, some change in family circumstances. If you have to wait over a month or 6 weeks, which is usual, you're going to have a problem with your landlord.
Well, these 12 beds that you're able to provide, and you've said are nothing like enough. I mean, how many do you think you'd really need if you were going to deal with the scale of the crisis you're confronting?
That's really hard. I think we quite often see the rough sleeper number bounce around 20 or over.
Are there other shelters as well beyond yours?
OK, so there are local hostels that you can apply for, but the referral process takes weeks quite often, and they'll do it as quick as they can, but they're underfunded. So, yeah.
Well, let me go back to you, Ms. Keegan. One of the things which keeps cropping up is universal benefits system, that in fact the change in the benefit system, whilst perhaps good on some levels, is a problem in terms of bridging the moment that you need it to the moment when it comes.
Well, and possibly that's what's going on in High Wycombe. I know in my own constituency in Chichester, very few people actually are in receipt of universal credit. We haven't rolled it out, apart from to a very small group. So that's certainly not the biggest driver of homelessness, which has increased. Rough sleeping has increased as well.
But there's a sort of acceptance, isn't there, in government that the old system wasn't working well, that the new system needed to come in because it simplified it, but there is this problem in both systems that they are hard to navigate at the front end.
Well, I think that's why in the budget there were some changes to universal credit. There was a 2-week housing benefit that was introduced. There was also a reduction in the amount of time, I think from 6 weeks to 5 weeks. And there is also obviously loans available immediately, same-day loans available if anybody does find themselves in difficulty. And I think the prevention strategy is very much more of a focus, and there was more money also promised for prevention. Overall, everybody says, even the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, lots of people that I've met are in favour of universal credit. It's more the implementation, and clearly, on top of what we've got today, we do need to be very mindful of implementing universal credit with housing in mind and with keeping people, not making sure that we create these problems of homelessness just from moving from one system to the other. But you know, universal credit there has been some changes very recently, and it hasn't been rolled out certainly in many parts of the country on a vast scale. It's quite a slow rollout.
Gillian Keegan, thank you very much for joining us, and Brandy Albury, thank you very much indeed. Living on the street can be a cold and chaotic life, but most of all, a very lonely one. Without a support network of family and friends, many choose to own a dog for security and for companionship. Now, a group of vets have started a registered practice to give treatment to street dogs and offer their owners vital, regular contact. They call themselves the Street Vets. Porrick O'Brien has been out with them, spending time with these unconventional dog owners and seeing the profound bond that they have with their pets.
More than anything, it's company. It's having another heartbeat that's on your side.
People laugh at me, right? I say she's like my daughter. Then you got people like him up there. His dog's got 3 legs, I don't know why.
What can we learn about homelessness, about rescue and redemption, from relationships that people on the street have with their dogs? According to Andy Hutchinen, a lot.
Let's go, Bailey, wait for Daddy.
Why did you call Bailey Bailey?
The reason I called Bailey Bailey was because I actually bought him off the street, off a beggar, when he was 4 weeks old. And the £12 that I gave for him, the beggar actually, who was a street drinker, went and bought a bottle of Baileys. So I thought, that's quite upmarket for a street drinker. There's his name.
Andy and Bailey will serve as our guides on London streets. One man and his dog on one remarkably similar journey.
And I'd been a heroin and crack addict for about 15 years solidly, in and out of jail. I was laying on my prison bed this night on another sentence, and I just thought I've had enough. And as I stepped out of Pentonville, opposite the road, there was two street beggars, and they each had a puppy that was tiny, still blind. They were that young. So I give them £12 for him. I took him to the vet the next day, and the vet reckons he was 4 weeks old, and they'd doped him up with Valium so he wouldn't cry for his mum. So I've had him since then. I had to get him off the drugs. Weaned him. I've had him since, and I haven't touched the Class A drugs since.
First up, a free outreach session by the charity Street Vet.
Stay still.
There you go. So he gets a little orange eye.
Andy is concerned by a cloudy patch in Bailey's eye.
It's not really binding to that cloudiness.
By day, Sam Joseph works in a private practice. By night, along with more and more vets across the country, volunteers on the streets. Why do you do this?
You know, you can tell from Andy and Bailey that their bond is incredibly strong between them. And I want to protect that bond, really.
Is the relationship between homeless people and their pets any different from the relationship between people in houses and their pets?
I think we see maybe a more complex relationship between homeless people and their dogs, and maybe a more intense and profound relationship.
Complex and intense. Jade Statt, another street vet, will do the introductions.
To be honest, they are in really good health. You know, I have to be honest, and you know, I'm not just saying that.
Like, would you say some of the owners look after their dogs better than themselves?
I think Ian would probably say that he probably does that.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. My dog's name is Stark, as in Game of Thrones.
For Ian, his dog is a friend, yes, but also a working dog, an enabler of his homelessness, providing security and income.
Most people, 99% of people that give me money is for the dog.
What sort of relationship do you and Stark have?
It's just a good relationship. He keeps me warm and I look after him and keeps idiots out of my face like
Again and again we heard stories of how in the chaos of life out here, these animals serve as an anchor for people like Danica.
She's like my daughter. I couldn't be without her.
Yeah.
It's when you're homeless and that, oh, I'll give you £1,000, I'll give you this to buy your dog. And it's like, no, she's not for sale.
So you've had people offering you like serious cash for Sky?
To take her, people that want to fight dogs. And they think I'm desperate for money, so...
Well, you'd never sell her?
No, and I don't think anybody would really.
Less than 10% of hostels in the UK accommodate dogs, mainly because of health and safety. So some people will stay on the street rather than be separated from them. In other words, this complex relationship can also sometimes be a barrier to people getting off the streets. For Andy, it was the opposite. He's now in temporary accommodation, and it was his relationship with Bailey that coaxed him off the edge. And once upon a time, quite literally.
I've been out there alone. It's a very lonely place. I've contemplated suicide. I've even gone to the bridge. I was going to throw myself in, but it just looked too cold, you know. And then I had Bailey with me, and I was thinking, do I go in with him? And then it was, who am I to choose? We all only live once. Who am I to choose when his time's up? So then I'm thinking, I have to leave a note for someone. You know, and I couldn't find a pen and paper, and he just convinced me it wasn't right. That was the lowest I've been. Yeah. And I ended up I sat there for a couple of hours, just staring at him, and he just convinced me. Because there is communication there. It may not be words, but it's there. And like Bailey said to me, what are you doing, you fool? You know, come on, let's get out of here. Let's go get somewhere warm. And he turned me around again. To say he's a lifesaver. Truly is.
I bet down across the road here in the doorway there, yeah, in the American Candy doorway.
Over 2 nights, stories of abandoned dogs rescued by people who know a thing or two about how that feels. How have you ended up living on the street?
It's a long story.
It's a long story.
Yeah.
Nobody else will be there.
Later we swung by the American Candy Company again. Passers-by oblivious to Ian and Stark, asleep under the blanket. Last word to Bailey's owner, Andy.
But when you're stood there, hungry, and no one's noticing you, just walking by as if you don't count, but with him, it gives me a roll. It's having another heartbeat that's on your side.
Porrick O'Brien reporting.
For people who are homeless, particularly sleeping rough, looking after their health is often the last priority. Without a permanent address, it's hard to get a GP. Many find it a struggle to access other forms of care. And it's why diseases like TB are on the rise. The charities are trying to tackle these growing issues by offering frontline healthcare to those on the streets this Christmas, as Tom Clark reports in the latest in our series on Britain's homeless.
This is Michael, aged 34. As well as being homeless, he's got a long list of health problems. A form of Tourette's syndrome, damage from a stroke linked to previous drug use, now arthritis in most of his joints. But getting the healthcare you need isn't easy if you don't have an address.
When you want help, right, do you have to verbally scream and shout it out, cry for help? Because that's what we're doing out here, mate. These addicts and alcoholics out on the streets that want help and would like help. But it's hard getting that help.
Health experts talk about social risk factors, sleeping rough or in poor quality housing, having drug and alcohol problems and poor nutrition. Many of Britain's homeless have all of them. And one disease evolved specifically to exploit the most vulnerable, tuberculosis.
Have you seen people with TB? Is it something you've come across, and is it?
Yeah, I've seen people coughing up blood and dying on the side of the road, man, because of TB. And it hurts me to see that and to know that's still going on.
This is barn door raging TB. This is TB is a disease that primarily affects the upper lobes. We're getting this sort of cloudy effect, and they're filling with this fluid and pus because there's an infection in there.
This chest x-ray is from a homeless woman who, now her TB has been diagnosed, will get the treatment that can cure her disease. But it wasn't taken in hospital. The clinic came to her. This mobile unit is the only one in the UK dedicated to screening homeless people for TB and other life-threatening conditions. And it's more important now than ever.
Rates have come down a little bit in the last couple of years, but in the population that we serve, homeless people in particular, numbers have gone through the roof. Now, the symptoms of TB are cough, weight loss, night sweats, fever. Those symptoms are perfectly masked by the lifestyle that people experience on the street. So, delayed diagnosis, onward transmission, severe lung damage. So we are necessary to actually find people early and make sure that they can take their treatment.
Just stand with your chin on the ledge there, that's it. Hands on your hip.
After proving successful in London, the NHS is now being asked to fund find and treat services like this in other major cities. They're busy over Christmas as other health facilities are closed. Homeless charity Crisis is also gearing up tonight to provide medical services at its outreach centres.
Some of the challenges we've got at the moment is increasing number of people who are homeless, and we're seeing that number increase. I live down in Brighton and Hove, and every week you see more and more people on the streets there. So it's actually the accessibility to services, and as a healthcare professional, it can be difficult many times. Actually, we haven't got the resources to meet everybody's needs.
The NHS is already planning for another difficult winter caring for the general population. Spare a thought for where that leaves those who don't have a home to go to.
Well, all this week we've been looking at the subject of homelessness, and the response has been overwhelming, especially to our film about Andy, a former heroin addict who lived on the streets for years and who says his life has been saved by his love for his dog Bailey. It's a piece that's been viewed by more than 24 million people on Facebook, with so many people offering to help the pair. There's no doubt homelessness seems to have more resonance at Christmas, but what can individuals and government do to actually try to properly tackle the problem of homelessness? Earlier, I sat down with some of those on the front line. Well, I'm joined now by Andy and his dog Bailey, who lived on the streets for many years. John Kurt is from the West London Mission, and from the homeless charity Crisis is Rebecca Pritchard. Andy, we met you in the piece earlier in the week where you told the story of how, in a sense, Bailey saved your life and helped you get off the street. How difficult was that?
It was very difficult, very, very... I had many false dawns, but in the end, through just love, basically, a lot of hard work, a bit of determination, and I just wanted better for myself, you know? Just wanted more. You talk about love from Bailey, obviously, but the hard work, where is the hard work in getting yourself off the street? How difficult is it? It's life on the street isn't just a case of sleeping in a doorway. It takes over, it's life. Your neighbour is the person sleeping up the way and all that. It's just like everybody else's life, but a different spin on it. So it's the homelessness, the addiction, the crime, the constant circle. To break that circle and be clear of that circle without being dragged in, very difficult, very difficult. And so what would have made the difference for you, say, earlier in your life? Is there anything that someone could have done for you? I think some of the services have improved a lot over the last few years. But back in the day, I remember if you said, like, there was a day I decided, today's the day I'm going to get clean today, but you'd make an appointment, you wouldn't be seen for 3 weeks, you know what I mean? So it was just impossible. And being homeless, you know, postmen don't deliver your mail to, you know, doorway number 3 up the road. So yeah, communication and just staying in touch. It can be chaotic. Very much so. You miss appointments with benefits. The same, you miss an appointment with your benefits now, you're sanctioned for 4 months. How does that help anybody? I mean, John Kurt, you run projects and night shelters throughout the year.
That's right.
What is going wrong that we don't seem to be able to tackle this problem?
Well, I think life is so fragile. People, for so many people, so many more people than ever are really living on the edge. And like Andy was saying, you can, for some of us, we're fortunate we can make a few mistakes or a few things go wrong and we've got other safety nets. I think for increasing amounts of people, you know, one mistake, a loss of a job or a breakdown of a relationship, and they're ending up on the streets. And we are seeing at the moment a huge crisis unfold. And there is an absolute scandal in terms of the amount of people who are vulnerable and that are, you know, rough sleeping going up 134%, you know, in the last 5 years. It's something that is a system that just isn't working, that urgently needs addressing. I mean,
Rebecca, crisis by definition speaks about a sort of immediate emergency, a sort of temporary emergency. You were set up 50 years ago. It sort of suggests that homelessness, you know, is inevitable, that it's now part of modern society and we can't do anything about it fundamentally.
We absolutely do not accept that homelessness is inevitable. There will always be people who have challenges, whose lives are fragile, but we actually have seen over the years that homelessness can be ended. In 2010, we came very, very close to ending rough sleeping. And as John was saying before we went on air, Boris Johnson had an absolute commitment to end rough sleeping by the end of 2012. We're now in the end of 2017, and as he said, it's more than doubled in that period. But that is a result of policy choices and decisions that can be made, and different decisions can be made. So one of the things that Crisis are doing this year is, by the end of our 50th anniversary, we will have published a plan that actually shows that it is possible for homelessness to be brief, rare and non-recurring.
What do you think about that, Andy, when you hear it?
I think politicians should hang their head in shame. We live in 21st century London. There's parts of London that Dickens would recognise, literally. Homelessness, poverty, it has no distinction of class. I meet writers, artists, all kinds, you know. Some people are only 2 wages away from homelessness at any time.
But where's the disconnect, though? Because charities like Crisis and Shelter seem to me to be very, very prominent, and yet we don't seem to make a huge difference at the end of the day in terms of the numbers.
Well, I think, as Rebecca was saying, in 2010, you know, there was previous efforts, coordinated, charities working together with the local authorities, which really did bring rough sleeping down. Investment in social housing, and you know, actual proper investment. Now, over the last 7 years, that's reversed and gone the other way. And there's been a huge profile. Probably this December, I've never seen more coverage on homelessness ever in the last 20 years. I don't know whether it's going to make much difference. I think a lot of us are very concerned with universal credit rolling out, that it's just going to get worse and worse.
And you show me where there's any social housing being built in London now. The private companies buying up all the bits of land, whopping up 25 flats, you know, £100 million flats, and where is any social housing?
And, you know, you talk about, you know, the empathy, the profile in the last month, say, which we do see a lot at Christmas, and we're all partly to blame for only raising it at Christmas. People have contacted us in huge numbers saying, what can we do individually? What should individuals do? Because that's the dilemma, isn't it? There's advice about whether you should or shouldn't give to homeless people. I mean, Andy, what's your thoughts about that?
It's different things for different people. I mean, you know, sometimes for me, someone just taking time to talk to you, to recognise that you're there, you're worth something, you know? Even that, just someone saying, hello, how are you? A little thing like that can make a massive difference to somebody's state of mind. You have to remember, with the homeless, a lot mental health issues come up, drug addiction, things like that. And going back to the charities, I also think it's disgusting that the government, these charities that do wonderful things, they're charities, the government is actually using them as a stopgap to prop up what they should be doing anyway.
And Rebecca, what's your feeling about how well the services work to tackle the many problems that people can have? Because often it's not just not having a home, isn't it? It's mental health, it's addiction.
Yeah, and there's always room for improvement. And I think what we've seen over the last number of years is that austerity has impacted on all of those services. You know, there is a really great commitment at the moment to increase investment in mental health provision, but we've yet to see that really make a difference. But also I think people could become more politically aware and actually tell their MPs that they care about homelessness, and actually they do expect their MPs to do something about it.
Yeah, I'm really fond of this Desmond Tutu quote. He said, you know, we shouldn't just be pulling people out of the river, we should be going upstream and see who's pushing them in.
And Andy, tell me, what is it like when people just walk past you?
You're nothing, you don't exist. They look through you or ignore you. I've had comments like, well, if you're hungry, eat your dog. You know, well, that's not very helpful, is it, you know? But, yeah, no, just a smile, spending some time with someone, it can make a major difference to that person's life for that day.
Because it's lonely.
Exactly. And, I mean, how can the government justify spending billions on aircraft carriers when that money could literally be used to eradicate for good?
Yeah.
Do so much good.
And, you know, like your story shows, you know, your relationship, you know, with your dog has been so important. And I think, you know, investing in you know, we can be materially rich and relationally poor. And that has such a big impact on so many people. When people are resettled, so often, if they haven't got good connections and networks and community, then they'll come back on the street.
Yeah. Can I say, sometimes you can get a roof over your head, but that can be more frightening than being on the street. Suddenly you're faced with bills, having to, you know, pay bills and
hassles,
the normal living sort of thing. But you've been on the street, you're not used to all that. So I've known people walk out of it because they just can't deal with it, and it's easier and more comfortable just to be where they were.
I mean, that's one of the things that people have to tackle, don't they? I was at a shelter recently and they were saying that someone had got a home, he'd been homeless for ages, and he handed the keys back in within a month because it was too much.
And I think that's where the support element comes in.
Definitely.
You know, no man is an island, as they say. You know, people need relationships, you need social capital, you need people that you can rely upon for when things do go wrong. And if that's a support worker or another organisation, rather than friends or family, then that's fine, as long as there's that in place. And I think one of the really potentially excellent things about the crisis centres over Christmas is that we have 11,000 volunteers going in, which shows that people do care. You know, there are people, and we have waiting lists. We have people who can't volunteer because we don't have the space for them. So people do care. They do actually put themselves out to do something. And what we try and do now is link people into our all year round services, or, you know, work really closely with people like West London Mission to kind of make sure that people know where to go if they are leaving the shelters.
So that it goes beyond Christmas.
Absolutely. One of the busy things in a job like mine in December is dealing with all the interest. You know, it spikes hugely. And of course, in January, people are still going to be homeless. You know,
poverty isn't seasonal.
It's not. And there's a sort of, there's a bit of a sentimentality, which, you know, we just need to watch, because there's a heightened concern at this time of year, which is an opportunity. You know, people really do care. People really want to respond, and it is heartening. And if we can help people respond in the right ways, so you know, be compassionate, spend time, connect people with the services, and campaign. That's a great way to go.
Andy, last word to you. I mean, what's your message as we approach Christmas?
My message would be just care. I mean, show a bit of humanity to people, you know? And not just at Christmas time. Don't give someone a quid and think, oh, I've done my bit, I feel a bit better for that, you know what I mean? It's not just about money, it's about action, it's about caring, it's about, let's change it. Because our voice is massive. If we all spoke on the same hymn sheet, they'd have to listen. Because politicians want votes, you know, they'd have to listen to what we want. But at the moment, copying a deafen.
So you're not optimistic?
I am in some of the people I meet, where I am at the moment. I've got a roof over my head now, thank the Lord, but, you know, there's days I might not eat for days, I might have no electricity, might not have no gas, so that is not the be-all and end-all. It's just about investing in people, support them, show someone a bit of trust, show someone a bit of compassion, and you will give them the opportunity to show what a beautiful human being they really are.
Brilliant place to end it. Thank all of you, Andy, Rebecca, John and Bailey, of course.
Thank you very much.